Hey, warmer brother, welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you. We're going to have a two-part conversation with Evan Miya. He does great work over at his website, evanmiya.com, taking a look at this great game of college basketball. The reason why we're doing a two-part conversation is that we really didn't see a lot of news and notes in college basketball on Saturday. Toby Nadozie, who was over at Coppin State, he was MEAC Defensive Player of the Year. He went to Jacksonville State, and you saw Curt Flood, who was a former very highly touted junior college transfer, decide that he was going to go to Southern Miss, and that was about it. That will take like 2 minutes to be able to sum up. So instead, we are talking with Evan Miyakawa about all these great NBA draft decisions that we saw over last week. Who are the winners? Who are the losers? What should we take out of them? And what guys might, in general, just be those big difference makers for this upcoming season? On top of that, some of the residuals of what we saw from the NBA draft decisions, because inadvertently Texas A&M was able to land Pop Isaacs as well. What's their outlook? And so much more. And if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. And if you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you, for this podcast, you have one of two ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, Larry CM, they meet us on Matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And while we did not get in any Twitter/X questions today, everything is powered by EdgeBoost. EdgeBoost, making sure that bettors are able to get everything that they need at their fingertips, that they're able to access their funds 24/7, 365, in leap years, 366 days out of the year. When you go to edgeboost.bet, type in that promo code of Greg, G-R-E-G. That'll get you a dollar for dollar match on your first deposit up to $25. And now let's chat with Evan Miyakawa, who you're able to find on Twitter/X at Evan Miya. That is M-I-Y-A all together with regards to that last name. And Evan, great to get you aboard. Thank you.
Glad to be here. A lot of exciting stuff to talk about with all these NBA draft deadline decisions and whatnot. I think rosters are coming a lot more into shape, and so there's a lot to talk about here.
Yep, there is so much to talk about, and we just saw the NBA draft decisions happen this week, and I'm not sure how you took a look at these NBA draft decisions, but I've said it on the podcast the last few days, and I'll say it once again. It just feels like ever since NIL dollars and this new day and age has come in college basketball, there's always been many more winners and losers with regards to these decisions, and I felt like that was the same this season.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think what we continually learned every season is that just because someone's saying they're planning on doing something doesn't mean that's actually going to happen. And so a lot of times we get a few surprising decisions going either direction kind of once the deadline appears.
Yeah, no question about it. And I thought that one of the most surprising ones was the fact that Todd Pettiford returned to Auburn. And I want to get your thoughts on this Auburn team, because them duplicating what they did last season, I don't think that was going to be happening. Because when you lose a guy like a Johni Broome, you know that things are going to be going downhill a little bit. But I felt like had Auburn not gotten back Pettiford, there'd be a little bit of issue and strife out there in the backcourt. And out of all the decisions, I thought that this was one of the most meaningful ones in terms of what it meant if he was/what was not going to be in the lineup.
100%. I think of all of the most impactful players to decide to return to college, I expected Pettiford to come back, but still the fact that he is officially doing that is absolutely massive for Auburn. I think Todd Pettiford, given what we saw from him in year one, the fact that he'll now be probably the main featured piece on this Auburn team next year, I think he has the potential to be a first-team All-American next year. That's how high I am on this guy. And so the fact that, he came off the bench last year and was arguably the best sixth man in the entire country. But obviously they had, Johni Broome leading the team, who was, one of the two best players in the entire country. Well, now Pettiford has the entire show to himself. I think he's, they've gotten a lot of other good pieces through the portal, but I think Pettiford is far and away the best player on this team, in my opinion, next year. And so I'm super excited to see what he's able to do. And I think he could be one of the most exciting players in the country. And I really do think this makes a huge, huge difference for Auburn's outlook.
Yep, I am right there with you. I do think that Auburn is going to be able to get a lot of production out of him. And really the SEC in general was a bunch of winners with regards to what we saw over the last week. I recognize that Arkansas losing out on Abdou Thiero, that's a little bit rough for them. And if there was a loser out there in the SEC, it certainly was Arkansas, because even though Boogie Fland returned, he went to Florida. And I think that's a very good team to take a look at, because for the Gators, I can't put them as like number one preseason or anything anything like that, but I think that this team should be at the very minimum in the neighborhood of a top 5 in terms of a preseason ranking, if not right there in the top 5, because getting back Alex Condon, bringing back Ruben Chinyelu, even though it's going to be a little bit of a new look backcourt, getting Boogie Fland as well, this was a very impactful last 14 or so days for Florida.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think the addition of Boogie Fland really does put this team back firmly in the national title conversation. I think they would definitely have a case to be a top 5 team, no question. I had Boogie Fland as a top 2 transfer in the entire portal, according to my transfer projections at evanmia.com, where basically I'm looking at every single player, their individual stats, their recruiting profile coming out of high school, expected growth, all these things go into predicting how valuable they're going to be next year. And Fland was number 2 in the entire country in terms of predicted impact because he was such a good freshman, has a really good recruiting profile coming out of high school. When you put all those things together and you look at the leaps that oftentimes these freshmen like him take into their sophomore year if they stay in college, I think he has the potential to be a really good player. And so, getting on Florida, I think, is a massive, massive boost for this team. I think without him, it would have been a struggle for me to say that they were, had a chance at repeating as champions. But with Fland in the mix there, I think that it's absolutely in the cards. And you look at their top, 8 or 9 pieces, and they're all really, really talented, either really experienced or really skilled there. So I think it's very exciting for the Gators.
Oh, no question about it. And then you're able to throw in there all the great rebounding that they had a season ago. And how interesting is it to take a look at a team like Florida? Because, their offense last year was better than it was 2 seasons ago. But as we know, ever since Todd Golden has taken over, it's a team that they very much rely upon second and third chances, not necessarily knocking down their first chances. And with a guy like Walter Clayton now at the fold, that's going to be very impactful. But I always think that it is a fascinating sort of puzzle to take a look at these teams that they do such a great job of being so dominant on the glass. And Florida looks like they're going to be that once again this year.
Yeah, one of the things that made Florida so good last year was that once we got to the Final Four and Micah Handlogden was back in the fold, they had like 4 really, really good big guys that they could throw at a team. And now, hey, guess what? They're all back. Thomas Haug is back, Khan is back, Chinelu and Handlogden are all back. And so the fact that you have those 4 guys, and there's been talks about being able to play up to 3 of them on the court at a time because of the versatility that Thomas Haug showed last year, that's going to be so scary. This team has already won a national championship with that front court. And so, yes, you're going to lose the guards that you had last year. But bringing in Xavier Lee and Boogie Fland to replace that, I think they're going to be very good, especially in the offensive end. A.J. Brown is another solid addition from Ohio. But that front court, that's going to be really scary given how successful they were last year. So it should be a lot of fireworks in that area.
Oh, there certainly should be a lot of fireworks. As joining me on the show, a man that creates a lot of fireworks, Evan Miyakawa over at evanmia.com. He's joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, and I want to get your thoughts in terms of most meaningful guys that return to school, because we just covered one of them in Todd Pettiford, but in terms of this team on the national landscape, they're not going to be some sort of top team or anything like that. But Mississippi State getting back Joshua Hubbard, I thought that his impact was huge, because if he did not return to Mississippi State, I do not know where that backcourt scoring was going to be coming from for them. Always a pretty rock solid team down low. They're getting back to their roots. They've added a few guys in from the portal that should be able to help out with that. But I want to get your thoughts as to how impactful you thought that was for Mississippi State, because I thought without him, they would be pretty lost.
Yeah, absolutely. Josh Hubbard, I think, is one of the most fun players in the country. You could draw comparisons to the type of electricity that he has and a guy like Todd Pettiford, who we already touched on. Hubbard is a really elite scorer. He's also a really elite playmaker, too. And I think he was already kind of the face of his team last year. And now coming into his junior season, I think it's really going to be the Josh Hubbard show for Mississippi State. They brought in a lot of other pieces through the portal, but I don't think anyone else is quite at the level of what Josh Hubbard brings. And so for him to be running the show at point guard, I think is going to be really crucial for this team. So yeah, like you mentioned, Mississippi State, not necessarily in the same camp as some of these other elite teams in the country, but man, Josh Hubbard is going to make a huge difference in terms of their season outlook with getting him back versus if he had stayed in the NBA draft.
Absolutely. I thought that was a big one. And I do have to address this as well, because for Alabama, it looked like they were very much moving on without LeBaron Philin. He decided that he was going to be coming back to school. How do you rate him out? Because it did feel like sometimes his numbers at Alabama were a little bit empty from time to time, but I think that him going from season number 1 to season number 2 and having a much bigger role with Mark Sears being out of the fold, I think that he's just such an interesting guy for Alabama, and one that I thought was very unexpected for Alabama with the way that they were building throughout the process here in the offseason.
I think LeBaron Philon has all of the tools to be an all-SEC type player, if not better. I think the fact that he was able to, oftentimes come off the bench last year and be the kind of spark plug that the team needed. There were obviously so many talented pieces on that team. Mark Sears, Aiden Holloway, Latrell Wrightsell, and other pieces in that backcourt, many of whom are coming back outside of Sears. But the fact that you're going to be able to hand the keys to Philon in a way, I'm just really excited to see what he can do. He's another one of these guys who, again, really good in a freshman season, was a really good recruit out of high school, so he has a lot of untapped potential still. Going into his sophomore season with a bigger role, a lot of times these guys excel. I think he absolutely fits that mold. I think he could be one of the best players in the SEC next year. And so I think until he returned, which all indications up until this week were that he was intending on staying in the draft. So it was a bit of a surprise that Philon decided to come back to school. I think without him, this roster was looking pretty shaky for next year. And I think the fact that he's coming back is one of these decisions that does really make a big difference. I still think Alabama is probably going to be, a bit of a tier below where they've been in the past, maybe not a top 5 or top 10 team. But I think with getting Philon back, they're still very much in the conversation of being one of the contenders in the SEC, potentially having Final Four potential, that sort of area.
Yep, I think that this is a massive one for them, and I think that it's going to be a lot of fun to watch Alabama this year, as it's always fun to have Evan Miyakawa aboard. He does great work over at evanmiya.com, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, and I think that this is a great stopping point for part number 1 of our conversation, and we'll pick it up on the flip side by talking about some of the losers that we saw in terms of these NBA draft decisions, talk about Texas A&M, the fact that they got some residuals from the NBA draft decisions as well, with the fact that they're going to be getting Pops Isaacs and so much more. So put that on the flip side with Evan right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hughes Peterson, now a part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hughes Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast, being rejoined by Evan Miyakawa. He does great work over at his website, evanmiya.com, doing an excellent job breaking down this great game of college basketball. He's looking at this game from every single angle, and we talked with him a little bit earlier about what we saw in terms of a lot of the winners, what we saw in terms of a lot of the bigger time moves. How about if we talk a little bit about some of the losers now, because we certainly have many more winners than losers, but there were a few teams that maybe didn't necessarily get the shake that they were looking for. There were a few teams that certainly were hoping for better results. Duke is one team that certainly comes to mind with Cedric Howard deciding that he is going to be staying in the NBA draft, but who are a few teams that maybe you felt like this process wasn't necessarily so kind for them. Not even necessarily due to NBA draft decisions, but maybe you just expected a little bit more from them.
I mean, there's a couple different options here. I think maybe an obvious one is Arkansas losing Adou Thiero to the NBA draft. I think this was maybe a little bit more of a surprise than some people thought. And the fact that they lose Thiero and the fact that they had Boogie Flan transfer when he was also going through the draft process and then decided, I'm coming back to college, but I'm transferring, that leaves them a little bit light. So I think that's a bit concerning there. I think the other two things are you had two major transfers who hadn't committed yet in Jameer Watkins and RJ Lewis. They were both looking at potentially Kansas as a destination. They both decide to stay in the NBA draft. So Kansas isn't able to land either of those guys. And so I think that's potentially a loss for them too, even though neither of those guys were on the roster, signed potentially, they were still kind of in the waters, but that is a miss that Kansas wasn't able to get either of those guys.
Yep, I think that it was very big that Kansas wasn't able to. And just how do you take a look at this Kansas team for the upcoming season? Because I had higher expectations for them in the transfer portal, and it just feels like they've really fallen flat this offseason.
Yeah, and I think with the fact that, you look at the last two off seasons, and Kansas has been one of the, if not the, national title threat in the preseason, and they've fallen short. And then you, in retrospect, look back at the roster build, and you're like, I don't know how these guys are supposed to work together. There's already a lot of skepticism on how Bill Self is building these rosters. And so now you look at this team who you have Darren Peterson coming in, who could be the best freshman in the entire country next year. That's awesome. But outside of that, and maybe Flory Badunga, is there a lot else here to be really excited about? It's hard to say. And so the fact that they weren't able to land a bigger fish, at least up until this point, through the portal, I think is a big miss. And so, yeah, definitely more concerning. And I think this is going to be kind of a litmus test year for Bill Self and the Kansas Jayhawks because they've been really disappointing the last 2 seasons. Now the roster looks kind of shaky. How are they going to be able to, kind of rebound and potentially find success that they weren't able to have the previous 2 years, arguably with a worse roster than they've had coming into the season recently?
Yep, no question about it. I think that they're going to be such an interesting case study as well. And then speaking of what we all got in the SEC, another big one is Otega Oweh returning to Kentucky. And for Kentucky, I think that it's an interesting team because I look at 2 teams throughout this process that they were very rock solid with first-year coaches, but I feel like they could be even better in season number 2. Obviously, Michigan with getting Yaxel Lendeborg and him returning to school, but also with Oweh going back to Kentucky because for Kentucky, their main weak point was down low. They were able to address that with Jaden Quantins coming on over from Arizona State. And then with Michigan, it was all about the turnovers with Elliot Cadeau deciding to transfer on in over there and still having the Twin Towers with Lendeborg, and then you're able to throw in their guys like Morris Johnson and company. I think both of these teams in season number 2 under their respective coaches and in their respective conferences have a chance to be able to have even more success than they had in year 1.
I agree with that. And I specifically of those 2 teams, it's really hard to choose which one I like better. I think both have had incredible outlays in the portal in terms of the players they've brought in, both the quality and quantity of those guys. If we talk about Kentucky, getting Oweh back, I think, was expected, but making that official is still huge because he really is the big piece that you're returning from that team last year. And then all of these other transfers that you brought in, Jalan Lowe from Pittsburgh, who's going to be a really solid point guard. Denzel Aberdeen was on Florida, who won the national title next year. You're going to have a front court with Mo Diabate and Jaden Quainton. So I think that duo is going to be really, really awesome to watch. Kim Williams coming off the bench potentially. He's a great three-point shooter. Surrounding all of those players around Oweh to kind of return and lead the ship. You've got Brandon Garrison in the photo as well, not to mention some of these other players who could play a role there too. I just think this roster has a ton of talent, a ton of athleticism. I think they're going to be a top 10 team next year for sure, and hopefully improving. Michigan as well. I really like them, and I think it was always kind of felt like a 50-50 decision whether Yaxel Lendeborg was going to indeed transfer and not go to the NBA. And the fact that they were able to, get him officially, I think is going to be huge. I've been waiting for the last 2 seasons really to see him more in the spotlight because he's been an incredible player, but playing at UAB in the American Conference where he wasn't really in the spotlight. Well, now he will be at Michigan, and you throw him in the mix with some other really good transfers as well. Elliot Cadeau as the point guard, I think a lot of people are maybe a little bit hesitant on him just because of how volatile he was at North Carolina. I personally, and looking at the statistics behind him, think that he still has a lot of really good potential. I think he could be a better fit for this team at the point guard spot than people think. And so all things considered, I really like this roster a lot.
Yep, and with Cadeau, you know that he's going to take care of the ball. He might not be necessarily the world's greatest three-point shooter or anything like that, but that was the weak point of Michigan. They just need someone to not turn the ball over, and I have faith in him being able to do that as well. And how about if we talk about one team that had one NBA draft decision, which you sort of knew it was going to go their way. Mackenzie Mbakbo, he decided that he was going to withdraw from the NBA draft, and he decided that he was going to be transferring to Texas A&M. But now they pick up Pops Isaacs with what Houston decided that they were going to do with Milo Suzon coming back. That meant that Isaacs was going to be pretty much out of the fold there. I think that's such an interesting Texas A&M team because they are bringing in Bucky McMillan as their new head coach. With McMillan, he did such a great job of being able to run sort of a havoc style over there at Sanford, generate a bunch of turnovers. And I want to get your thoughts as to how you see the Sanford team really being able to mesh because they don't seem to have quite that same combination that they had over at Sanford. It doesn't feel like they've got as many guys that can generate turnovers, but I just look at this roster and I see a lot of talent.
Yeah, the talent is definitely there. I think the challenge is, this is a similar situation to what you had for Texas A&M this year. New head coach, entirely new roster. It's very similar to what you had for some other high majors last year, like Kentucky and Louisville, who were pretty successful with those years. But you had several other high majors like, Cal and USC and DePaul, who all had similar situations and they fell short of expectations. I think that's what we're looking at with Texas A&M. So there's a lot of talent on this roster. You look at names like Pop Isaacs, Rylan Griffin, Mbako, Federico. All of these guys are known, proven commodities, but getting all of these players to mesh together in a new system, in a new environment, with no continuity to speak of, is always going to be a challenge. And so I think I would have a bit of tempered expectations for this team, where we're definitely going to see flashes. We're going to see moments where A&M plays really good basketball and it's really fun to watch. But there's also probably going to be games or series of games where it's just like not really clicking, just because of the challenge of bringing all these pieces together and trying to figure out what is our identity here. And so, I think this team is good enough to make the tournament, but it's definitely not a sure thing, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Absolutely, and I do think that it's going to be a lot of fun to see what we've all got on this front as well. And I just want to open it up to you as well. Is there a move, it could be an NBA draft decision, it could be a transfer move, what have you, that you've seen over the last few weeks that you just feel like is going a little bit under the radar? It's going to be able to make a bigger impact than I think a lot of people might see on the surface.
Well, one team we haven't talked about yet is Houston, who got Milos Uzan back. And, I think a lot of people initially coming into the offseason expected Uzan to come back. But his camp was sort of saying that he was fully set on the NBA draft. And so, Houston had, a contingency plan with Pops Isaacs there. But then you get Uzan back, who I think is, objectively, you want that guy back because he had an incredible year for Houston last year. And so I think that a lot of people have been talking about Houston as a potentially the best team in the country next year, if not a top 3 team, a top 5 team. I think having Uzan back with Emmanuel Sharp and Joseph Tugler, kind of those 3 starter quality guys back for a team that made the national title game is huge. And so I think the leadership that he's going to bring is significant. And so that's a really, really big deal for Houston to get Uzan.
Oh, it is a big deal, but not as big of a deal as getting you on this podcast, Evan, because you do such an amazing job taking a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. You're dialed in with your metrics, and you're doing an amazing job of getting set for the upcoming season. So let the good people at home know it's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Absolutely. So you can find everything at evanmiya.com. That's EVANMIYA.com. We've been talking about a lot of transfer portal stuff. I have transfer portal rankings, projections, skill grades for every single player in the portal. I have transfer class rankings where you can look at what teams have done the best work in the portal, and a bunch of other stuff that's going to be helpful as the offseason goes on, as the new season comes up in just a couple months, really. So you can find everything there. You can also find links to all of my social media platforms, including Twitter and X, on my website at evanmiya.com.
And Evan does such an incredible job taking a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball, and every single time he joins me, he lends such great insight. So big thanks to Evan for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of 2 ways we fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_D1. Keep in mind, letters CM, they mean does not matter, so per usual, please do send these into the timeline. The other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And a big thanks to Evan for joining me for this chat. He does such an excellent job breaking this game down. He's one of the best statisticians out there that you are going to find, and I'm with you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season. So I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.